As it turns out, Devi Shetty and his team decided to do both. Both take the cardiac care scale-driven model and apply it to other therapeutic areas, and also take the basic idea that they pioneered of scale-driven medical interventions and try to see how they could share that with the rest of the world. Both of these are inevitably works in progress. I'll touch upon both of them in sequence. Let me take the within India but evolving to other therapeutic categories first. The first phase of the evolution was very much to take the heart surgery cardiology model and apply it to oncology, ophthalmology, obstetrics, a couple of other areas, right in Bangalore, right around the same place that the heart hospital was built. So what was envisaged was a health city of sorts. The notion was that there's a lot of infrastructural investment that had already been made for the heart hospital that could be augmented to some extent, but the same, for instance, radiology facilities, the blood banks, the nursing facilities could be used to apply to a bunch of other therapeutic areas. So one of the new focus factories that's emerged, for instance, is in oncology. It's run, just by way of example, by a really accomplished oral and maxillofacial surgeon who specializes in repairing the faces of people who have been traumatized by forms of oral cancer. So imagine a horribly disfigured face. I know it's hard to imagine, but somebody who cannot even look at himself or herself in the mirror and recognize themselves. Paul Salins, the gentleman who runs this focus factory, just like Devi Shetty runs the cardiac focus factory, is an amazingly accomplished scientist, medical professional, and dare I say it, an artist. To watch him work is a pleasure. So his office is surrounded with paintings, modern art, Kandinsky, what have you. And he looks at a face and says, how am I going to repair this in a way that the person, the patient, will recognize himself or herself when I'm done with it, but will also use the best of modern science. It's just a pleasure to watch, a privilege to be associated with him in any way at all. But Paul is also after the same basic principle. It is so basic, it just bears repetition. All we want to do is figure out, is there a way to break down what we do into pieces so that we can get a lot of people going through it, get scale, learn from the intense expertise building properties of pure repetition, as well as use the scale to get better deals for our consumables, equipment, physical plant, things like that, in exactly the way that Devi Shetty showed could be done with cardiac care and cardiology. If we can lower the cost of the treatment and make this treatment available to all sorts of individuals who would otherwise go untreated and sadly would probably die. Now, my medical students often push back and say, appropriately I might add, that perhaps something like this is less susceptible to economies of scale. Maybe it's possible that there's less repetition in this than in some forms of cardiac care, like a so-called CABG surgery, coronary artery bypass graft. And I think they're right. Not everything can be broken into bits and pieces. We are limited by the extent to which we understand the knowledge base. The understanding is what allows us to break tasks into bits and pieces and allows us to so-called modularize the tasks so that we can break it up into parts that are done by other people, parts that are done by us. And some forms of care are just in their infancy. It truly isn't the cutting edge of science. But Paul's reaction to that is that may be right, but there are other areas in oncology, just to stick with that example, where we can modularize. Think about the early detection of cancer. There is no reason why that cannot be broken down into bits and pieces and tasks. There's no reason why that cannot be subject to a rudimentary checklist of sorts that could be handed off to people to go and implement and find people. So he's trying to innovate and say, this focus factory ought to look at the entire spectrum of care in oncology and all its derivative traumas and find areas where the scale model can actually work. And that's what he's after. And the thing to emphasize here is that this is quintessentially an act of entrepreneurship, just like the cardiac surgery model that now seems so set in stone was entirely an act of entrepreneurship, experimentation, and iteration for the last decade. So I see no reason why this shouldn't work. It's very hard to predict exactly what form it'll take, but it's very well on its way. And remember, he's got a leg up because he does have the fixed infrastructure of Devi Shetty's health city to free ride on in some ways. And just like him, there's another person doing ophthalmology, there's another person doing renal disease, there's another person doing orthopedics, and so on and so forth. So the emergent structure, if you were to imagine looking at it from the air, is a fabulous health city, possibly the largest in the world, that is delivering care at a fraction of ambient prices to broad swaths of humanity in India, primarily the poor. It's an amazing thing to see, this health city. You know, I'm presenting it as though it's a beautifully orchestrated set of buildings that you can go, but frankly, even today, 10 plus years after it first emerged and started to exist as a recognizable entity, to me it always looks like a construction site. There's a lot of dust everywhere. There's super modern buildings that have gone up that house state-of-the-art care. There are a lot of poor people primarily wandering in and out. There are temples and chapels. There are state-of-the-art cars. There are simple two-wheelers and bicycles. But mostly there's dust and noise. And imagine a field, imagine a lot of cows, imagine a lot of beggars wandering around, and then suddenly there's a building. And then 3 years later, there's a blood bank. And 3 years later, there's a little road that connects everything. And another 2 years later, there are a couple other buildings. It's an evolving canvas in a sense, but dust everywhere.